Greetings to the Church of Denby Bottles. It is an absolute blessing to be able to speak to you today on this, my last Sunday with you. And of course, a great welcome to anyone watching this service who is not part of Denby Bottles or has never been to the church, but has, for whatever reason, happened to stumble on this video. A very, very special welcome to you, and I'm very glad you've joined us this morning. For those who might not know, I am the pioneer worker for Denby Bottles Methodist Church. And for those of you who do not yet already know, this is my last Sunday as the pioneer worker for Denby Bottles Methodist Church. This is indeed the last Sunday that I will be employed by this church. For some of you that might be a very happy thought, for some it might not, I do not know. However, I can speak for myself in saying that I'm really in two minds about how to feel about that. In one sense, I'm really excited about what comes next in my personal journey with God. I'm very excited to open up that new chapter in my life. Another part of me is very saddened by the prospect that this is my last Sunday and the idea of moving forward outside of Denby Bottles, because I have truly loved the last 3 years of working at your church. It's been a blessing to get to know you all. It's been a blessing to pray with you all and just move with you all in what God has called us to. A lot of me really doesn't want to leave that. I mean, this in itself is very, very strange when I think back of how I got into this job. I worked at a church before coming to Denby Bottles as the pioneer worker, and it's safe to say in that job, as a youth and families worker, everything went completely wrong. So much so that they took my 2-year contract and shortened it to a year just to get rid of me. I desperately didn't want to do any more church work, at least for that time. I had lost so much confidence in myself, and quite frankly, I didn't know what I was going to do. But a lady I'd been meeting with at the time, a Methodist minister, she used to meet with me and pray with me and talk through things with me. She handed me a job advert, and it was the job advert for Denby Bottles Pioneer Worker. And she said, "I really think this is for you." Despite feeling like I had proven to myself that I couldn't do church work, and despite having had such a negative experience, I felt very called by God to this role. So much so that I put all my eggs in one basket. I remember going to the interview at Denby Bottles and thinking, if this doesn't go well, I've got nothing to fall back on. I remember thinking that if I don't get this job, I've left everything else so late. I've not applied for other jobs purposefully. I've turned down jobs purposefully, so that if this doesn't go right, then I'm going to have to move in with friends or with family and with no job prospect on the future. And I actually remember the first time I ever went to Denby Bottles Methodist Church. I remember the first time I came here. I arrived something like 45 minutes early because I wanted to look around the local area to get a feel for what was around here. I figured it might give me a little bit of an edge in the interview when I could show I had some local knowledge. But I walked past the front of the church and I thought, is this the church? I had no idea if this was actually Denby Bottles Methodist. So I walked in, and greeting me in this hallway was Alison James, such a lovely lady. And I asked her, is this the church where the interviews are? And she said, yes, and welcomed me in and took me into the back, into the prayer room, where I waited for my interview to begin. And so I'd lost my edge in looking around the local area, but it did mean I got a good 45 minutes to talk with Alison and John Haslam and Bradley Smith in the back, which was a real blessing. I vividly remember the interview. I was sat down on this very sofa, and opposite me on the sofa was Andrew Weisel, Sam Critchlow, Hannah Miller, Jenny Lawrence, and the minister at the time, Judy Smart. If I've forgotten anyone else off that, I apologise, but that's who I remember distinctly being opposite me at my interview. It's quite a daunting thing to be sat in front of so many people, all with clipboards with questions on and writing down things as you answer the questions. A strange fun fact, actually, Judy didn't ever really wear her dog collar to signify that she was the minister. So for the longest time, I think realistically up until about a week or two before I started in this job, I genuinely thought that Andrew Weisel was the minister, just because he's the one who emailed me, he's the one who confirmed the job, and yeah, for the longest time I thought Andrew was the minister. But anyway, as they asked me the questions, I tried my best to answer in a way that would show my passion for following God. And ultimately, it was that passion that led me to come to the interview. It was that passion that led me to be there on that day. When I left, I started driving home, and it was about a 3-hour trip back to where I lived at the time. And I got a call on the way back, and it was Andrew, who told me on the phone that they'd been deep in prayer for hours after I left. And they'd really been thinking between me and another candidate, but they'd finally settled on me getting the job. I had put my faith in God as I felt he had called me to this position, and it paid off. It's funny the things you remember. I can even remember the first sermon I heard at Denby Bottles. The preacher was none other than our own Sam Critchlow, and he was preaching on Moses and the burning bush. I remember it most of all because he kept saying that we all needed to listen to that holy blaze in our lives. I couldn't have agreed with him more. So you might be wondering why I'm telling you all this, and partly it's because I want to stress the fact that God has a plan for each of us. And my time here has shown me that even when we feel beaten down, when we've lost our confidence, when we feel like we've lost that very thing we thought we could do, or that one thing we thought we were good at, God can still build us up. God still has a plan for you. God can build us up if only we will follow his call. I was terrified about the idea of going back into church work. I remember for the first 6 months of working for this church, I was really worried that I was going to get called into one of my management meetings and they were going to say the exact same things my last job did, that I wasn't doing enough, it wasn't working out. All those fears would come back, but that never happened. I think to myself, if I'd have ignored God's call on my life to come to this church and I'd have instead done what I wanted to do at the time, which was go away from church work, I'd have missed out on possibly some of the greatest years of my life. But then you might be thinking, well, why mention the first sermon you heard by Sam Critchlow? Was it all that amazing? Well, it was a good sermon, but the reason I mention it most of all is because it really ties into what I want to say today. So I stand up here with the lectern, ready to give my final address to the church. I finally want to bring you to our reading from today's service. And on the surface of things, it's a really sad reading. It's the death of Moses, one of the most popular characters to appear in the Bible, and it's his curtain call. It's not like he's going on to something new like I am. He's going to die. But in so many ways, I think it's one of the most exciting parts of the Bible. As I mentioned earlier, when I listened to Sam's preach, when he was up here, God first revealed himself to Moses as a burning bush in Exodus chapter 3. He shares with him his plans for Moses' life. And Moses at this point has fled from Egypt and its Pharaoh and its authority, really, because Moses had killed an Egyptian who was beating up a Hebrew. He'd seen the Egyptian beating up this slave, and Moses leapt in and eventually killed this Egyptian who was harming the Hebrew. And because of this, Pharaoh wanted him dead. So Moses fled from Egypt and fled from that area. He had no desire to go back to Egypt. So when God appears to him in the form of a burning bush and says, I want you to go back to Egypt. No, I don't just want you to go back to Egypt. I want you to confront the Pharaoh. That must have been terrifying. I moaned a second ago about how it felt terrifying to me to go back into church work after a very apparent failure. I wasn't being asked to go somewhere where they would kill me. I mean, I'd have had to do a pretty shocking job for you to want to kill me. Now, that was a scary message. So what if Moses hadn't have listened to God? What if Moses had heard the burning bush, heard God's voice for him, heard God's plan for him, and said, no, actually, I don't want to do that? What would have happened? Well, when you read the Bible, chances are Moses' life would probably have been easier. Chances are Moses still would have led a pretty happy life. We can't know for sure, but we can certainly speculate. Once Moses fled from Egypt, he married a woman named Zipporah, and she gives birth to a son for both of them called Gershom. You can see this in Exodus chapter 4, verses 21 to 22. So Moses has a family. He's set up somewhere. He's got a wife. He's got a son. If he'd have turned away from God and decided, I'm not doing that, he'd have still had a family. He'd have still had a livelihood. On the surface of it, Moses might have even spared himself from a lot of the difficulties that came his way. He would not have had to contend with facing Pharaoh. He would not have had to contend with freeing the Israelites. He would not have had to contend with taking them through the wilderness for 40 years. He would not have had to contend with all the issues that came at that time. People attacking the Israelites, people turning away from God. He wouldn't have had to deal with any of that had he just stayed with his family. And all of this begs the question, then why should Moses listen to God's plan? Why should Moses follow that plan? Especially if he's got a life that's pretty good at the time. And if you're watching this and you're not a Christian, then I'm going to struggle to translate it to you. If you're watching this and you're a Christian, then you probably know what I'm about to say. There is more to be gained through God than can ever be lost. In that same time, Moses met with God on several occasions. Even through all the difficulties, he met face to face with God. He spoke with him. Moses was key to the creation of the first 5 books in the Bible. Many people tell you that Moses wrote the first five books of the Bible. I don't believe that on the grounds that the first 5 books write about his death. I find that very difficult. However, yes, Moses was integral to the first 5 books of the Bible being here today. He has been immortalized in the scriptures in a way that nobody else ever has. We can see this in our reading in Exodus chapter 34, verse 10. It says, "And there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face." He knew God face to face. Can you imagine? I don't think of the death of Moses as being a tragic thing. I don't even imagine Moses being scared of death, if I'm honest. He might have been. I said there's all speculation on my part. But when I think of Moses' passing, when I think of Moses dying, for a man who was so close to God, to know that he was soon to be even closer to God, he was going to transcend that bond. He was no longer going to be on this earth, but instead with God. That must have been pure excitement. The best thing Moses did with his life was follow God. Even when God called him to the things that seemed dangerous, even when God called him to the things that didn't appear to make sense, even when God called him to things that looked like they were doomed to fail, Moses followed God. He freed the Israelites. He established God's people and the early law. He set the foundations for the coming of God himself in the form of Jesus. You cannot underplay the value of Moses. You cannot underplay what this man achieved through his relationship with God. Sometimes there is something bittersweet about following God in that way, because it means we don't always get what we want. Imagine all the effort Moses put into leading the Israelites through the wilderness. As he's leading them through the wilderness, God has promised that he will lead them into a land flowing with milk and honey. He will lead them into a land for them. That's what they're going towards. Moses has put in all of this work, and yet he never got to go into the land that God promised them. Moses put in a lot of work, but never got to see the fruit of that work. He didn't see the completion of it. Now, those watching this saying, well, are you kind of saying you're Moses in this analogy? No, that's not what I'm saying at all. It has been my pleasure to work here for the last 3 years, to work alongside you all tirelessly, reaching out into the community, trying to share the love of Jesus with both each other and with those beyond these walls. And yes, I do feel like I am leaving this church before the fruits of that work have fully come about. But that doesn't mean that I'm like Moses. It means we all have a choice, just as Moses did. We can either follow God above all else, we can prioritize his plan, even when that plan seems doomed from the start, or we can resolve to just be content, to just accept what we can amass for ourselves, to just accept what we can do in our own lives. As crazy as it sounds, we can refuse the greatest aspect of life. In these last few years, I have shared in your prayers, Denby. I have shared in seeking God's vision for this place. In 3 years, I feel like God has given me a glimpse, just a mere glimpse of the capabilities of this church. I mean, I'm asking you, I'm pleading with you, do not be content. Do not do what is safe. Do not follow what society deems as success. By society's measure of success, Moses was a failure. He led the Israelites out of Egypt with the plan of leading them into the land that God had promised them, and he didn't get there. From a societal point of view, Moses left his family. I mean, his family did go with him, but Moses left that comfortable life he had for hardship, never to actually see the end goal. As Christians, we measure success differently. He knew God face to face. He spoke with God. He set the foundations of the Christian faith. And then, before they reach that promised land, before they reach that area, he goes to be with the Father. That's not a failure. That's success. I challenge you, Denby, be daring, be mad, follow God at all costs. Even when that seems doomed from the start, even if that seems radically different to all your other plans. Denby Bottles Methodist Church, I've learned a lot about you. I remember when I first came to this job, I went around asking people about the church, about its reputation. Denby Bottles has always turned heads in its willingness to do new things, to be daring. Years from now, I want to be able to hear rumblings within the Methodist Church. I want to hear rumblings within the Christian movement within the UK. That the church in Denby Bottles has been uncompromising in following God's plan. If or when the doors to this church open up again, seek God first. If your doors must remain shut for a time, for whatever reason, seek God. God's church is larger than Denby Bottles, but anywhere can be the spark that sets the revival to the church. It's not right that we say it's Denby Bottles and then everybody else, but it is right if we say we are Denby Bottles and we're going to try and bring revival to the wider church. The church is doing that, that's fine, but we're following God. We're doing this. We're being daring. We feel God's called us to do that, and when everyone else tells us it's doomed, and when everyone tells us it's stupid, we say no. We are following God. These last 3 years, God has shown me a mere glimpse of what everyone at this church is capable of. Move into it. Be like Moses. Be daring. Be closer to God. And part of the moral of Moses, part of the story of Moses, is knowing when to let something come to an end. Part of the lesson of Moses is knowing that everything has its time. That might be a time for the doors to be shut. That might be a time for a job to come to an end. Heaven forbid, it might even be a time for you to stop coming to this particular church and try somewhere else. I don't know. It might be time for you to start coming to this church. It could be anything. Everything has its time. Everything comes to an end. And that's not a sad thing. That's not a sad message. Because when something comes to an end, it means something new can begin. If you stop a plan, you start a new one. When Moses died, it wasn't that the Israelites just shut down. Instead, Joshua took over where Moses had started, and Joshua led those people into that promised land. Joshua took what Moses did and ran with it. Ultimately, in this analogy, I am not Moses. I'm barely even Joshua. The history that Contagious has, the history that this church has, all I've been doing these last 3 years is trying to pick up that ball and edge a little further with it. I'm so sad to know that I'm leaving this church and this job. The schools that I've gone into, the people I have met, the friendships I have formed. God has done a lot with me these past 3 years. And if I didn't seek to follow God, I think I'd have been very happy staying here for as long as you'd have me. But it's just not what God wanted. So that's my sermon today, and it's a challenge to all of you. Be daring, follow God above all else, because it will equals success. It will be the greatest thing that you ever do. If you're watching this and you're not a Christian, it's my plea for you, it's my prayer for you. Come to know Jesus. And if you're watching this and you think, I don't really get what this guy's on about, message the church. Put something in the comments below. Ask someone for prayer. Ask a Christian you know to talk to you. It's the greatest part of life. Without God, it's just nothing. But you don't realize how little it is until you know God. It's been nothing short of an honor and a privilege to serve this church for the last 3 years. And so for the last time, as your pioneer worker, thank you and God bless.